Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Good evening.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Brian Phillips for inviting me to come and speak with you this evening. I received the invitation to come and speak to the Right to Life Association here through him. And I have to say it's a great honor and a great privilege for me to be here. I read somewhere, not in that biography, but in another one that said I was from Toronto, but I'm not from Toronto. I did study in the seminary in Toronto, but kind of looking back on it, I consider those years to be a little bit like my Babylonian exile. I did grow up in Ottawa, although I was born in India. My parents came to Canada when I was very young. And as Dr. Phillips mentioned, I'm a convert to Catholicism. I've been to New Brunswick a few times, but I regret to say it was always kind of in passing through to another province. It was usually during summer vacations, a couple of times we have come out east and we spent some time either in Nova Scotia or PEI, but we passed through New Brunswick. So I'm glad to say that this time I'm here to actually be in New Brunswick and not just to pass through. It's a very beautiful province that we have. And, on the news I saw the flooding and everything that was taking place here, and I've been praying a lot for the people of New Brunswick. It's amazing to see how something like that can bring people together and how it can make people really understand that we belong as brothers and sisters to one common family. And it's so inspiring for us to see that, especially here as part of the maritime spirit. I think the eastern provinces are known to be very warm, and it's something that I've experienced every time I've come here. So it's a great honor for me to be here. As you can tell, I'm not a politician, so I'm not going to be talking too much about public policy. I will be talking a little bit about pro-life issues that I think are important, but not so much from the standpoint of the political arena. I'm not a businessman or a scientist per se, so I won't really be addressing questions from those perspectives. I'm going to be talking about certain pro-life issues from the perspective of faith. As was mentioned, I'm a parish priest in a kind of mid-sized suburban parish in the east end of Ottawa, Good Shepherd Parish. And even though I will be addressing some of these issues from the perspective of faith, I believe that many of the things that I'll talk about are not things that you necessarily even need to be Catholic or Christian to agree with. Many of these are truths I think that anyone with an open heart and an open mind, just with the light of natural reason, would be able to agree with and understand with us. The great Pope, St. John Paul II, he spoke about faith and human reason as being kind of like two wings by which the human spirit soars to a knowledge of the truth. And I think that's very important. He spoke about how they don't contradict each other. And so much of what we do in the pro-life movement is strengthened by our faith, of course. But at the same time, there's a lot that's actually inscribed in the natural moral law that we can know even through the light of natural reason itself. Now, I'm sure that most of you would probably agree with me if I were to say that we live in a somewhat crazy world today. Our modern Western world has changed radically over the last few decades. Certain truths that humanity has always acknowledged in the past are today routinely ignored when they're not explicitly rejected. But most, if not all of these truths, most of them tend to fall within the moral order, the order of ethics and morality. I'm sure many of you remember the turbulent 1960s and everything that took place during that time. As you know, it was a time of radical ideas and ideologies, especially in the domain of ethics, sexual emancipation, as it was sometimes called, which really changed the way that people today see moral truth, and it still affects us today. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Cardinal Carlo Caffarra, one of the faithful cardinals in Rome, who recently passed away. That particular cardinal, he explained in a public interview that he had received a personal letter from Sister Lucia of Fatima. Sister Lucia, who died in 2005, she wrote to the cardinal. She was one of the three visionaries at Fatima in Portugal in 1917, when Our Lady appeared. As you know, last year we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the apparitions in Fatima. And Sister Lucia, who by that time was an elderly religious sister, a nun, she wrote to Cardinal Caffarra, and in her letter, she spoke to him about one particular thing that Our Lady, the Virgin Mary, revealed to her, a very important truth about what we could call the end times. And this is what Sister Lucia told the cardinal in her letter. She said, "Our Lady said to me that the final battle between the Lord and the kingdom of Satan will be over marriage and the family." And then she added, "But do not be afraid," Our Lady said. "Even if everyone who works for the sanctity of marriage and family will be fought against and opposed in every way, do not be afraid, because the important thing to remember is this, that Our Lady has already crushed the head of Satan." It's a very powerful quotation, which is also very prophetic. A prophecy given to the world by Our Lady of Fatima in 1917, I would say, to prepare us for the battle that was to come some decades later, perhaps about half a century later. The final battle between Christ and Satan will be over marriage and the family. These strong words that were revealed in the first quarter of the 20th century are being fulfilled, I believe, in our own days, under our very eyes. We are all witnessing in some way that battle against life, marriage, and family. Many believe that this final battle really started to occur, or at least began to be revealed, around the year 1968, when Pope Paul VI published one of his famous encyclical letters, Humanae Vitae. Humanae Vitae was a letter that was largely rejected by secular society, but sadly even in some parts of the church. This encyclical is today to be considered to be very prophetic in nature. It's an encyclical that defended the Church's constant teachings in the area of morality, especially in the domain of sexual morality and life-related issues. In particular, Humanae Vitae's condemnation of artificial contraception is known today to have been nothing less than marvelously prophetic. The Pope wrote about the dangers of artificial birth control, he said, leading to a contraceptive mentality, one that would devalue human life and the gift of human sexuality. In his encyclical, Pope Paul VI wrote the following words, and I'm just going to quote a little bit for you. He said, "Those who are upright and just should reflect upon the consequences of artificial birth control. Let them consider, first of all, how wide and easy a road would thus be opened up toward conjugal infidelity and the general lowering of morality. Men, especially the young, who are so vulnerable on this point, have need of encouragement to be faithful to the moral law, so that they must not be offered some easy means of eluding its observance. It is also to be feared that man, growing used to the employment of anti-conceptive practices, may finally lose respect for the woman and may come to the point of considering her as a mere instrument of selfish enjoyment." This letter by Pope Paul VI shows that this fundamental assumption of the contraceptive mentality, the fundamental assumption is that we do not need to be responsible for our actions. And how many of us can relate to that idea nowadays? The idea that somehow we can engage in actions but disengage ourselves from the moral responsibility of those actions. Artificial contraception, in the eyes of the Pope, has opened up the door to a mentality that sees human sexuality as a means of control, of domination, of experiencing personal pleasure without any consequences whatsoever. Now, if women are no longer valued as they used to be and are seen as mere objects of pleasure, then I don't think it's hard for us to understand how pregnancy itself might be considered not to be a gift, but rather as a type of liability. Not just by the man, but even often by the woman herself who is pregnant. I'm sure that many of you have heard couples saying, well, we don't really want to have children. Children would just bog us down and prevent us from enjoying life. Sometimes this is not said in such a direct way, but it is surely implied at times. Children, unfortunately, in our world today, are often no longer seen as a precious gift. They're seen not as an asset that enriches our human experience, but often as a liability, as a burden that must be tolerated or, if need be, exterminated. But this disrespect for human life, it's not just something we see at the beginning of life. Today, the euthanasia movement has extended the same anti-life mentality by suggesting that if a person does not have a certain quality of life, then that person would be better off dead than alive. After all, such persons are considered to be burdens to society as a large, and even burdens to their own family. And as a result, they too should either be terminated or be given the choice to terminate their own life. It's very sad and very tragic for us to see such a mentality entering into our Western world. Many of you, I'm sure, have been following the tragic case of little Alfie Evans in Britain. That sweet 2-year-old boy, he was almost 2. He had a terminal neurological condition. And in the hospital, the doctors told his parents that there was no hope. You might as well give up hope, they said. They wanted to pull the plug, so to speak, on his life. But his parents, even though nothing could be done for him in that hospital, wanted to seek out medical attention in a facility in Italy. They believed that maybe there would have been some hope for the little boy. And so they wanted to have him removed and take him to Italy. In fact, even the Holy Father, the Pope Francis, was so touched by the story that he interceded so that that little boy could be brought to Italy. And on the part of the Italian government, there was no problem. The problem, though, was in Britain. Alfie's parents were told by the courts that they could not remove him from that hospital. They were denied even the possibility of trying to save the life of their child. It was such a tragic situation that I think touched so many people around the world when they saw or heard about it. So many people showed their support for little Alfie. The scary thing about this case is that it's almost as if the courts were saying to the parents of this child, your child doesn't belong to you. Your child belongs to us. How tragic that is when even our own children, in a certain sense, are considered to be almost as if they were property of the state. As a consequence, because persons are now seen sometimes as a property of the state, It's often thought that the state, meaning the federal or the provincial authorities, should be the ones to decide who should live and who should die, when one should live and when one should die. My dear friends, we're going down, I think, a very slippery slope in that regard. When persons are seen as mere properties of government or of the state, who can deny that we are headed for a terrible crisis? I would say a crisis even much worse than that of the human slave trade era. Human trafficking and the trafficking of human organs. It is officially illegal in all countries. But how much time will that be the case? And besides, we all know that it is already going on the black market. We know, for example, that Planned Parenthood, for example, has been trafficking human embryos and organs for a long time. They don't even deny it sometimes. And sadly, there is very little opposition to this, something that should make us all outraged at how ridiculous it is. We've been almost desensitized to this. The contemporary world claims to be unreligious and to base all of its important decisions on the principles of modern science. And yet many of our contemporaries today deny the most basic and fundamental scientifically proven truth in regard to human life, namely that the embryo carried in a mother's womb is already a human person, and as a result has a dignity and a worth that cannot and should not be violated by any other human being. The Western world's obsession with what it calls free choice has driven it to the point of even denying basic fundamental scientific facts about human life. Sadly, in our own country of Canada, our government is not just tolerating anti-life legislation, but is actively promoting it and even penalizing those who disagree with it. The well-known African human rights activist, Obianuju Ekeosha, has more than once condemned what she calls Canada's neo-colonialization practices in developing countries. What does she mean by that, neo-colonialization? She's referring to Canada providing foreign aid to developing nations on the condition that those nations liberalize their abortion policies and provide, quote, abortion services as a fundamental health service to women. Ekeosha decried this practice of our current government, and she stated very clearly that, and I quote, millions across Africa will see this as an assault on women, men, innocent children, and families. She went on to say that this is tantamount to an abuse of power and a cruel form of oppression of the poor. Canada used to be famous for exporting things like maple syrup and hockey players. But unfortunately today, our country has become known instead for its export of certain ideologies, abortion and many gender-related ideologies. Recently in Ontario, for example, as I'm sure most of you know, the provincial government, with the support of the Mayor of Ottawa, enacted a so-called Safe Access to Abortion law. It's commonly known as the bubble zone law because it creates a type of bubble zone around abortion facilities that forbids any kind of opposition to abortion to be expressed within a certain radius. One of Ottawa's most famous pro-life heroes, an elderly man by the name of Cyril Winter, used to be present across from the abortion mill in Ottawa almost every day, praying for an end to abortion and protesting quietly, sometimes by the means of graphic signs showing what exactly abortion does to our children. Mr. Winter recently passed away, but not before he became the first victim of that bubble zone law. he was charged under the new law and due to appear in court to be sentenced for violation of the pro-abortion law. God, in his mercy, took him out of this life before the date of his court appearance arrived. The anti-life, anti-marriage, anti-family movements are not content with providing those who believe in their ideologies with a forum for expressing their ideas. Instead, they seek to suppress any expression of opposition to their agenda. Those who are pro-life, pro-traditional marriage, pro-family are no longer even tolerated sometimes in our civil society. Their opinions need to be suppressed and even penalized by the state. This is how far, sadly, Canada has degenerated in its attacks against marriage, family, and life. As you all know, the current federal government in Ottawa has taken that oppression to a new level. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Prime Minister's new summer program, student program policy. And as you know, groups that do not adhere to the particular attestation and sign it, groups who do not support abortion, euthanasia, or gender ideology are denied access to funding for summer students. One such group that was denied funding is a wonderful Catholic charitable organization located near Ottawa called Wapu's Farm. Wapu's Farm has as one of its objectives to provide opportunities for children who come from poor families to experience summer family vacations. In fact, the charitable contributions of the donors to this organization are used in part to help provide vacations free of charge to children from poor families. Summer vacations for the children and for their parents. This group was denied funding under the Canada Summer Student Employment Program because of their pro-life, pro-family, pro-traditional marriage views. In fact, those views don't even directly affect what they are doing with these children and for these children. And yet, they were blasted even in federal parliament. It was said by the Prime Minister that they, quote, failed to defend the charter rights of all Canadians. Imagine that. Of course, what he meant was that they failed to agree with the current government's understanding of charter rights, particularly abortion and gender ideologies. It's sad, but one would think that instead of living in a free country, we're living in a country where very often now our thoughts are being dictated to us, and that we're told not just how we should act, but also what we must think. How much further can we go before our nation really crumbles? Historians will tell you that every great empire in history, that every great nation has always fallen primarily because of one reason: moral decay. The fall of Rome began from the moment that virtue gave way to vice in that society. If our Western countries continue to devalue and denigrate the sanctity of human life, from natural conception to natural death, then we can be sure that our fall will not be far to come. As St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta once said, a country that destroys its own children is a country without a future. It is a society that teaches its citizens not to love, but to use any means possible, even violence if necessary, to get what they want. End quote. And I think that quote is very important because it shows us the true meaning of the pro-life movement. The pro-life movement says that the best way to live is by love, not by control, not by manipulation of ideas and ideologies, but by loving one another. Jesus even says that in the gospel. It is by your love for one another the world will know that you are my disciples. And so the fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves is this: what brought about this decline in morality in the first place? What led to this total and complete rejection of moral truths and of a life of virtue? To me, as a priest, I think the answer is clear. The fundamental cause of the rejection of human life is the rejection of God from our Western societies. Because God is the author of life. He is the author of the natural moral law and the author of the divine laws. God is the source of all being and of life. When man rejects his Creator, in whose image he was created, then very quickly all human dignity and human rights become stripped away from society, beginning with the most fundamental human right, the right to live. What then, brothers and sisters, is the solution to this grave moral crisis of our times? How can we restore a culture of life? A culture that values life, marriage, the family? Well, if the problem has its roots in the rejection of God, in the banishment of God from the public sphere, from government to education, to healthcare, to civil law, if the problem is the rejection of God as a nation or a culture or a people, then really the only solution, the only way of restoring a culture of life that values the dignity of every human person is by bringing God back into our society. Why is it that so many repressive regimes in history have been aligned with atheism? Why do we not find, historically speaking, communistic or dictatorial regimes that acknowledge the presence and the supremacy of God? I think the answer is quite simple. Because God is the author and source of human dignity, and thus the true guardian of human rights. The best way to take away human rights and bring a people into slavery to some ideology is by removing from their society every reference to God. And that is why freedom of religion is inscribed in almost every single healthy and truly democratic country. Even Canada was a country that was founded on this principle of freedom of religion. The first colonizers, as you know, who arrived here from Europe and who set foot on Canadian soil, many of them right here in the Maritimes or in the adjacent province of Quebec, brought with them missionaries, because faith is the guarantor of a society that is truly free. Faith tells us that every human being in society has dignity and value in the eyes of God, because we were all created in the image and likeness of God. I'm sure that many of you don't know that the Canadian national anthem actually has 4 verses to it. We often only sing the first verse, both in English or in French, but there are 4 verses to the national anthem, both in English and 4 verses in the French version as well. The 4th verse, which is one that we almost never hear today, is one that testifies very strongly to the Christian roots of our country. The 4th verse of O Canada in French is particularly powerful in this regard. I want to give you an English translation of that French verse of O Canada, the 4th one. This is how it would be translated into English. Sacred love of the throne and of the altar, fill our hearts with thine immortal breath. Among the foreign races, our guide is the law. Let us know how to be a people of brethren under the yoke of faith. And let us repeat, like our fathers of old, the battle cry for Christ and for the King. The battle cry for Christ and for the King. Did you know that those words were part of our national anthem? I'm sure many of us have never heard them sung. Pour le Christ et pour le roi. These words were traditionally a part of the French version, and even the English version, with the 4 verses, makes an allusion to God as the supreme ruler of our land. This shows that the origins of our country are not secular, but Christian. God has always had a privileged place in Canadian society, until maybe a few decades ago, really from about the time of the 1960s and the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. Perhaps it is the removal of God from the public life of today's secular Canada that is the primary cause for the confusion that we see today. Life, marriage, and family are all natural institutions founded by God on the natural moral law. When we remove God from our society, these things all quickly crumble before our own eyes. And so, let us pray for one another. Let us pray for our beloved country of Canada. I don't personally believe for a moment that most Canadians are anti-life, anti-marriage, or anti-family. At least that's not what I've experienced talking to people one-on-one. These ideologies come from various sources, sometimes from big government, from the entertainment industry, from the mainstream media. But recent polls show, for example, that the majority of Canadians are in fact in favor of some kind of restriction on abortion, on euthanasia, and on other life and family-related issues. We can work together to rebuild this country and to rebuild in this country a culture of life, a culture of sound moral and ethical values, which is really what has made Canada such a great nation historically. Every human being is precious in the eyes of God, from the moment of natural conception to natural death. As the scriptures tell us, God is not the God of the dead. He is the God of the living. He is the God of life. Life is his most fundamental and basic gift to each and every one of us individually and to our country as a whole. It is a gift that we should all cherish greatly and that we should pray would be cherished by all people. I'd like to thank each and every one of you personally for your commitment to the pro-life cause. You can be sure that God will reward you greatly for your efforts. You are fighting on a side that often will encounter much opposition. But the important thing to remember is that you are fighting on the side of all that is good and noble and true. One day we pray that with the grace of God, the culture of death will be left behind us, and that every human being will be recognized for the dignity and value that he or she possesses in the eyes of God. I continue to pray for each and every one of you. I pray for your pro-life work here in New Brunswick. Let us continue to keep each other in our prayers as we continue this beautiful battle for the sanctity of human life. God bless you all. Amen.